Welcome to episode 2 of Truth Buried Deep, the podcast where we uncover hidden stories, chilling mysteries, and untold truths buried beneath the surface. Each week, we venture into the darkest corners of true crime, unraveling the facts, exploring theories, and confronting the lingering questions that still haunt us. This week, we delved into the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, a pivotal moment in history that altered the course of a nation. We'll examine the events leading up to that fateful night, the motives behind it, and the enduring mysteries that continue to intrigue historians and true crime enthusiasts alike. New episodes are released every Monday, so don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube to stay updated. You can also listen to Truth Buried Deep on Spotify, Podme, or your preferred podcast platform. For exclusive updates, behind-the-scenes content, and more, follow us on Instagram at @TruthBuriedDeep. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and join us as we uncover the truth, because some secrets are too big to stay buried.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to dig into some fascinating history.
Okay, well, today we're going to be looking at the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
Wow, that's a big one. A really pivotal moment in American history.
Yeah, it really is. And we've got a really interesting mix of sources for this one. A YouTube documentary transcript, some Wikipedia entries, and then an article that focuses specifically on the conspirators.
Sounds like we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do. But that's the beauty of these deep dives, right? We take all these sources and we really condense them down into the most important, most intriguing bits. So in a short amount of time, you're going to learn about Lincoln the man, what led up to this event, the assassination itself, the aftermath, the conspirators, and we'll even touch on some of the conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
To give you a really full picture.
It's a story that even after all these years continues to fascinate people, doesn't it?
It really does. It wasn't just a political murder. It was a seismic event that shook a nation that was already going through so much change and uncertainty.
Exactly. Think about it. 1865, the United States was literally divided.
7 southern states had seceded.
Right. They formed the Confederate States of America all because they weren't happy with Lincoln's anti-slavery stance.
Yeah, and it was more than just a political disagreement. I mean, it was a complete fracturing of the nation's identity.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that the South's secession wasn't just about economics or states' rights like some people try to argue.
Right.
It was deeply rooted in this system of racial hierarchy, where the enslavement of African Americans was essential to their way of life.
So for a lot of people in the South, Lincoln was a direct threat to that system.
Absolutely. A threat to their very existence.
So in this incredibly tense, volatile climate, you have Abraham Lincoln.
A man who, came from incredibly humble beginnings, born in a log cabin in Kentucky, self-educated lawyer.
And against all odds, he becomes president during one of the most chaotic periods in American history.
I mean, his leadership during the Civil War was just remarkable. He had to navigate all these political factions, push for emancipation, and of course, fight to preserve the Union.
Talk about pressure. The weight of the nation's future on his shoulders.
It really makes you wonder what was going through his mind during those years.
Yeah, did he ever sense the danger he was in?
Well, we know there was a lot of animosity towards him, especially in the South. And there's actually a chilling anecdote about his second inauguration.
Oh.
John Wilkes Booth, the man who would eventually assassinate him, was actually there.
Wow.
He even wrote about how he had the opportunity to kill Lincoln right then and there.
That's unsettling, like a glimpse into the future.
Isn't it? To think that the man who would take Lincoln's life was just feet away from him weeks before the assassination.
So let's talk about John Wilkes Booth for a second. Successful, charismatic actor from a prominent theatrical family. Yet he chooses this path of violence. What a strange paradox.
Booth's story is complicated. It's not a simple good versus evil thing. He was a product of his time, deeply immersed in the ideologies of the South.
And that's what's so hard to grasp sometimes, right? Their perspective on slavery was so ingrained, it's difficult for us to even fathom today.
It was woven into their social fabric, their sense of identity.
So to understand Booth, we have to understand that broader context, that belief in white supremacy, the justification of slavery as a natural order. It was widespread.
And those beliefs fueled his hatred for abolitionists and his unwavering support for the Confederacy.
So it wasn't just about individual madness or evil intent.
No, it was about the power of ideology, the way it can distort someone's perceptions and lead them to commit horrible acts.
And in Booth's case, you could say this ideology was intertwined with this warped sense of heroism. He saw himself as this modern-day Brutus striking a blow for freedom by killing a tyrant.
A twisted logic, but one that resonated with him deeply.
And remember, he was an actor, used to playing roles. So in his mind, he was taking on the mantle of a hero, fighting for a just cause.
Right. But how does this famous actor, used to this stage, to applause? How does he turn to plotting murder? What pushes him over the edge?
It seems like the turning point for Booth was really the war itself. As it dragged on and the tide turned against the Confederacy, acting started to feel, well, I think he used the words marginal and irrelevant.
Interesting. So, in a way, his decision to move from the stage to violence was almost a reaction to feeling powerless, like he needed to take action.
Exactly. He wanted to make a big historic gesture, and that's when his focus on Lincoln really intensified.
Because he saw Lincoln's reelection as a sign that the South was doomed.
Right. He became fixated on this idea that Lincoln was the root of all their problems, and that by removing him, he could somehow change everything.
There's that moment in the sources where Booth attends Lincoln's second inaugural address, and he hears Lincoln talking about reconciliation, reconstruction. Oh yeah, that seems to have really solidified things for Booth. Like, that was the confirmation that Lincoln was in there for good, that drastic measures were needed.
So how did he go from this intense frustration to an actual plan? Did he act alone?
He started gathering a group of co-conspirators. There was Arnold, Atzerodt, Harold, O'Laughlin, Powell, and Surratt. They met a lot at Mary Surratt's boarding house.
So that became like their headquarters.
Exactly. It was the hub for all their plotting.
And their initial goal, was it always assassination?
It's actually pretty wild, but their first plan was to kidnap Lincoln.
Seriously. Kidnap the President of the United States.
Yeah. They thought they could use him as leverage, force the Union to restart prisoner exchanges.
That is audacious. But then, what made them switch to assassination?
It seems like the shift was triggered by Lincoln voicing support for limited black suffrage.
Voting rights for African Americans.
Yeah, even just a limited form of it. It was a radical idea back then.
It's amazing how voting rights, something we consider so basic now, was such a huge deal back then.
It represented a fundamental change in the power structure.
So for Booth, Lincoln supporting that was a betrayal.
It was the last straw. It reinforced his belief that Lincoln had to be eliminated, a threat to everything the South stood for.
Tragic how a step toward equality became the trigger for something so awful. And so the stage was set for April 14th, 1865.
The night Lincoln and Mary decide to see a play at Ford's Theater, Our American Cousin, supposed to be a night of relaxation, a break from all the pressure.
And there's that element of fate, or maybe just coincidence. Grant and his wife were supposed to go with them.
Right, but they declined at the last minute. Who knows what might have happened if they'd been there.
Makes you wonder about those what-if moments in history. Tiny decisions having huge consequences.
But as the Lincolns are enjoying the play, John Wilkes Booth is getting ready to make his move.
He had it all planned out, didn't he? Went to a dress rehearsal the day before, scoped out the theater.
He knew the layout, the security, everything. Booth wasn't leaving anything to chance.
Chilling to think he was able to move around like that, totally unnoticed. Must have had a lot of trust built up within that community.
That familiarity gave him the cover he needed. So on the night of the assassination, he makes his way to the back of Lincoln's box, waits for the right moment, a laugh during the play to mask the gunshot, and then he fires one bullet, point-blank range, into the back of Lincoln's head.
What a moment. A nation trying to heal and its leader is struck down. What happened then? What was the immediate reaction?
It was chaos. People were screaming, running. Witnesses said Booth jumped from the presidential box onto the stage, shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants.
Wow.
A Latin phrase connected to the assassination of Julius Caesar. Imagine, you're in the audience, this familiar actor suddenly turns into a killer right in front of you.
It wasn't just Lincoln that Booth was after, though, was it?
No, you're right. This was all part of a bigger plot to take out the entire Union leadership.
Like a coordinated attack.
Yeah. While Booth went after Lincoln, his co-conspirators were supposed to kill other high-ranking officials.
So it was meant to cripple the Union? Maybe throw the whole country back into chaos?
And that just shows how fanatical Booth was. But thankfully, only Booth's part of the plan worked.
So what happened?
Well, Lewis Powell, he attacked Secretary of State William Seward, stabbed him multiple times.
Oh, wow.
But Seward survived. And George Atzerodt, he was supposed to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson, but he lost his nerve and never went through with it.
It's a reminder that even the most carefully planned conspiracies can fall apart. Human error, chance, They play a role even in these dark moments.
Absolutely. And so, while Booth succeeded in his awful act, the larger scheme failed. And in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, the nation had to face this incredible loss and the uncertainty of what would come next.
It's just so hard to imagine the grief that must have swept through the nation. This president who had led them through the Civil War struck down just as peace was finally coming.
Yeah, it really was a devastating loss. The whole country was in mourning. And it wasn't just the North. Even in the South, people were shocked and saddened. It's like everyone realized just how fragile things were.
But beyond the sadness, I imagine there was a lot of fear and uncertainty too.
Absolutely. Lincoln was gone. And now the responsibility of rebuilding the nation fell to Andrew Johnson, his vice president.
It makes you think, how different might Reconstruction have been if Lincoln had lived?
Right. It's a huge question that historians still debate today. Lincoln was all about reconciliation, bringing the country back together. Who knows, maybe his leadership would have led to a smoother transition, a more unified nation.
It's hard to say, of course, but it's a fascinating thought. But as the country was mourning, the search for the conspirators was on.
Oh, yeah, it was the biggest manhunt in American history at that time. Soldiers everywhere, looking for Booth and his accomplices.
And what about the people involved in the plot? What happened to them?
Well, the investigation quickly led them to Mary Surratt's boarding house, and they found evidence of the conspiracy.
So what happened to Mary Surratt and the others?
They were all arrested. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt. They were tried by a military tribunal and found guilty.
A military tribunal? Why not a regular court?
Well, because the country was technically still at war, and Lincoln's assassination was seen as an act of war, not just a regular crime. So they used a military court, which meant a faster trial.
I see. It was a way to show that the government was serious about finding justice and maybe deter any future rebellions. It makes sense given the tension at the time. What about Booth himself, though? Did he get away?
For a while, he did. He managed to evade capture for almost 2 weeks, hiding out with the help of some Confederate sympathizers.
Wow, 12 days on the run. That must have been terrifying for everyone involved. But they eventually caught him.
They did. Tracked him down to a barn in Virginia. His accomplice, David Harold, gave himself up, but Booth refused.
So what happened?
They ended up setting the barn on fire, and a Union soldier shot Booth. It was a dramatic end to the manhunt. But it wasn't really the end of the story, you know.
What do you mean?
Well, even with the conspirators caught and punished, there were still a lot of unanswered questions, things that fueled all sorts of conspiracy theories.
Right, because whenever you have an event like this, especially with a figure like Lincoln, there are always going to be people who question the official story.
Hmm.
What are some of the theories that have come up over the years?
Well, one of the most persistent ones claims that the Vatican was behind the assassination.
Really?
The Vatican.
Yeah, you see, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the U.S. back then. So some people suggested that because Lincoln was seen as hostile toward the Catholic Church, the Vatican wanted revenge.
But is there any evidence to back that up?
Not really, no. It seems more like a reflection of the religious tensions of the time than a real explanation.
So, more speculation than fact. What are some other theories that have gained traction?
Well, another theory suggests that the assassination was part of a bigger Confederate plot, involving high-ranking officials who wanted to make sure Lincoln was out of the picture. So Booth was just a pawn in a much larger game. That's a pretty compelling idea.
Yeah.
But is there any proof?
It's hard to say for sure. There's no smoking gun. But there are some things that make you wonder, like Booth's escape route, for example. Some historians think he had help from a network of Confederate sympathizers, which would suggest a more organized effort.
So the escape route itself could be a clue to a wider conspiracy. Interesting.
Exactly. And then there's the mystery of Booth's diary. It disappeared after his death. Some people believe it contained information that could implicate others, but that powerful people made sure it was never released. It's a missing piece of the puzzle.
It seems like even with all the historical records, there's always going to be some level of mystery surrounding Lincoln's assassination. It's a reminder that history is rarely straightforward.
You got it. It's like a tapestry woven from so many different threads. Some bright, some dark, some we can see clearly, others left in the shadows. Even with all the evidence we have, there will always be those gaps, unanswered questions, and different interpretations.
And that's what makes history so intriguing, right? It's this ongoing process of discovery, of questioning and reevaluating what we think we know.
Mm-hmm.
And it also highlights how powerful a single action can be. In this case, one man's choice, driven by hate, changed the course of a nation.
It's a sobering thought. It reminds us how fragile democracy can be, and that we always need to be aware of those who try to undermine it.
So after this deep dive into Lincoln's assassination, what's your biggest takeaway?
For me, it's realizing that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's a living story that still shapes us today. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, a man who represented unity and freedom, shows us how important it is to work towards understanding and reconciliation, even when we disagree.
It's a powerful message that we need to hear now more than ever. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Hopefully, this has piqued your interest to learn even more about this important moment in American history.
It was my pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Truth Buried Deep. If you enjoyed the journey into today's mystery, don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. You can also catch us on Spotify, Podme, or wherever you get your podcasts. Stay connected and get more updates by following us on Instagram at @TruthBuriedDeep. And remember, new episodes come out every Monday, so mark your calendars and join us as we uncover more secrets that refuse to stay buried.